Hello and welcome to a twilight, kind of semi-lockdown episode of Material Matters with me, Grant Gibson. As regular listeners will know, the idea behind the show is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Usually we do this by visiting the guest workshop or studio, but for the time being we're making do by recording over the internet instead, and it seems to be going okay. Thank you so much to everyone who's taken the time and trouble to listen so far. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by the excellent Lin Cheung. Now, I think it's safe to say that Lin is one of the most important names in jewellery design right now. Her output vacillating between installation pieces, work that contains political and social commentary, as well as high-profile commissions, including the medals for the 2012 Paralympic Games in London. She picked up an Arts Foundation Prize in 2001 and a Jerwood Contemporary Makers Award in 2008. In 2017, she was shortlisted for the Woman's Hour Craft Prize, while in 2018, she picked up the prestigious Francoise van den Bosch Award. She's also a teacher on the jewellery course at Central St Martin's. As one critic said, Lin's work is a commentary on the human condition, a conveyor of the maker's thoughts and feelings, a constant exploration into the meanings of jewellery. Over the years, she's worked in a range of materials, but at least to begin with, I'm keen to chat with her about her most recent collections, which have been made from stone. Lin, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. That's lovely.
That's a pleasure. Was that okay?
Yeah, thank you very much.
We usually do these interviews in our guest studios, as I said, or their workshops. Obviously, that isn't possible at the moment. So perhaps could you tell us a little bit about where you currently find yourself?
In one way, I know, in recent circumstances, that there's been a lot of dramatic change. But for me, it's not a huge difference or shift to what I would normally do. I live outside of London. I've got my, studio and workshop at home, and it's near Farnham, just outside of London. So it some days feel like a regular day because I would be here in the studio or at home, and working away anyway. And then the other half of the week, I'll be journeying into London for teaching. So that's shifted and changed, and it's sort of more drawn out. I'm sort of here every day. On the face of it, it just seems like a sort of regular day, until you switch on the news and, listen to the radio and see what's going on in the world. So, yeah, pretty much my practice and working environment hasn't changed. So I work in a way, I work from home anyway.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about your workshop, Lin? Is it very tidy? Are you a messy worker? How do you work?
You're not the first person to ask that. I mean, I think because I'm quite a private person and, I think with a lot of artists or makers, there's a very public side to you and it's always a curiosity to the private side, and I'm the same. I'm always curious to know how people work. So the tidiness, okay, it's not as tidy as you imagine. I like things as they are, and I like my own space and where I've left things. I think that's quite important. So I've got half the sort of workshop, the jeweller's bench, let's say, in the house, purely because it's warm, we've got heating in the house, and the other half is in the garage. Half is where I've got the sort of stone cutting, bigger equipment. It's a bit messy, it's cold in there, and I share that with, all the other things that you would find in the garage, the lawnmower, the motorbike, etc. So it's not tidy on the face of it, but actually it's always the same when I come back. So in that sense, that kind of tidiness is quite important to me. So if I've just left a tool where it was, or if I've left a mess, I know I can come back and sort of pick up where I left off. Yeah, so I've got half in the garage and it's half in the house.
And are you a biker? I'm intrigued.
No, it's my husband. So
Right.
It's a lifelong passion, of his. And I ride pillion. I did learn to ride a bike at one point in my life, but I never sort of progressed to my full license. So we have an interest in, sort of vintage vehicles and vintage bikes, motorbikes. So it's a big part of our life, actually. And a big part of the garage.
Can we kick off by talking about jewellery?
Yeah.
It seems to me that it presents a bit of a dichotomy. On one hand, it's seen as frippery and unnecessary, but on the other, we invest certain pieces of jewellery with a huge amount of emotional import, wedding bands, for instance. It's also quite a difficult fit. It doesn't seem to quite go into the art world or the design world.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, I'm interested to know why you think jewellery matters.
I think what I like about it, and there's something important, is no matter how it's defined, you could say from the high street to the artist studio and, and everything else in between, great important works of jewellery, you know, and collectibles, to the sort of throwaway, in fact, you know, that you find so easily, and to the homemade, is that I always find it fascinating because to me, it's still slightly shapeless, and we don't know why. Maybe we use it and wear it, and so I like that freedom. I like the fact that I'm contributing to something that we all can, and it's like an object that we can define it. It's in the dictionary. It says what it is, and we can all recognise it. Like everybody understands a piece of jewellery, and yet it still carries this sense of, it signifies a sense of the unknown in life. It's like an object that can absorb and make comment about all the uncertainties, you know, like, let's say, belief, like hopes, like dreams, like things that are intangible. It's an object that I feel that can kind of absorb some of that, and it's like you know, opens up a conversation and a dialogue through it. So there's sort of many examples of, I think we may know about it, we know what it's made of, but actually what it signified, why that person made it. And I'm thinking about things in, you know, museums and from other cultures, and we can marvel at what maybe that was trying to say, you know, on that day back then, or, you know, when it was made. And I find that really quite fascinating, that we still, as humans now, as, you know, as we go about our life, that there's still a part of us that needs maybe objects to lodge that sort of thought, put those thoughts in, or a way to communicate those sort of unknowns or hopes, and you know, that kind of thing. So I find that quite fascinating. Just when it's a bit like me, just when I feel like I dismiss it, because yeah, it can be any shape, form, any material. That's how I see it. I know a lot of people may not, you know, think that immediately pops into their head, but I find that quite fascinating, that it's this malleable, almost concept and form at the same time, you know. So yeah, and it keeps me going. I think, you know, I have a kind of almost like a love-hate relationship with it. and that kind of drives me in a way, you know. I find it fascinating. So I tend kind of not to take sides or have you know, I have personal taste, obviously, and connections with it, but I find it very fascinating to explore the ins and outs of why we wear it, what it looks like, who made it, where's it from, and the kind of why of its existence, you know. So yeah, and I feel that's very important. I think it, you know, I don't need to kind of, let's say, create a significance for it. It already is, and I feel comfortable with that. So it's not going to go away, and it's something that will remain quite important, you know, either individually or collectively and publicly, as a vehicle for expression.
Well, let's get into a little bit about the why from your perspective. As you know, this podcast is focused on materials. You've worked in a number, but to begin with, at least, the one I'm keen to concentrate on is stone, and particularly its use in your series Delayed Reactions, which are, I mean, delayed reactions, for the listeners, are fundamentally they're kind of the badges that you'd see in political campaigns that are usually made of metal and plastic. But instead of being made from metal and plastic and being cheap, you've fashioned them from lapis lazuli, for instance, and they contain a series of other messages. In the first instance, what are you trying to say with them, Lynn? What kind of messages do they contain?
Well, the ones that you've described out of lapis, so it's a very deep blue, and the particular pieces of that series, and actually inlaid into the surface are little gold stars. I sort of came across stone only recently and got sort of quite profoundly interested in it. I actually did a 5-day gem carving workshop with Charlotte DeSillis, and Charlotte lives and works in Norfolk.
Who's a brilliant jewellery designer in her own right.
Absolutely, right? Yes, and working for almost over 50 years now, gemstone carving, making pieces, you know, so, you know, a lifelong career of making jewellery and carving. So it started there, you know, in 2014, and something sort of just hit me straight away. So I went from having no knowledge or any appreciation, in fact, apart from, you know, just appreciating Charlotte's work and other gemstone carvers, but no intense interest. So actually getting hands on the material at that point, you know, something sort of popped in my mind, really. And I was just absolutely fascinated by it, not least because Charlotte's a wonderful teacher as well as a maker and incredibly generous. So the whole experience, I think, of discovering what you can do with the material, feeling it being cut, it sort of brought me back to maybe my earlier days in Brighton, where I trained on my BA, of that first moment of kind of feeling a material and going, what's this all about? And then something happens. You sort of there's a lovely sort of, not entirely a full understanding, but you kind of connect with it. And you go, okay, I'm onto something here. So it was nice to discover that again, I think, after all those years. And
why were you looking at stone in the first instance?
I think I had a kind of curiosity about it, and it was one of those things that had sort of fascinated me, but I had no knowledge. So I think I just signed up just to have a go and learn a bit more about it. So from that point, I think I understood that it was a very different process to how I'd worked before. I'd always constructed objects. I'd always brought the material and added to. And when you stone carve, it's a subtractive process. So actually, it's obvious you take the material away, and what you lose and what you reveal. So it was a huge shift in that sense as well. And I think it dawned on me that I'd not appreciated that before in my making. It was always an adding to, and a layering of something. So it felt quite profound because of that too. Not only discovering a rather beautiful material, and I'm generalizing here because there are different stones, but having to think about maybe being creative with it in taking that material away. So it started there, and the Delayed Reactions series was sort of part and parcel of that. I think in the couple of years before the Delayed Reactions badges came out, and that was in 2016, driven by how the political and social landscape was changing, in that year with the EU referendum, with what was going on in the US at the time. So in the 2 years gathering machinery and equipment to try and cut my own stone. So then I went away from Charlotte's and tried to set it up in the garage, here or at home, with only the knowledge that I got from Charlotte that day. But then I started to research. I started to look at secondhand equipment. I just gathered what I could and just wanted to get going as soon as possible. And I think that sense of maybe discovering something and looking at something afresh, with then by the time I caught up in 2016 with everything else going on, it felt like I was just trying to find my way with something. And at the same time, there was this cathartic feeling of trying to find my way through what was going on in the world at the time with material in hand. So this is looking back. At the time, I was still just kind of messing around with the stone and cutting, and and the frustration of that, breaking things and going, okay, that's not what I expected to happen, or I wonder how to do this. There was all of that kind of frustration and loveliness of discovery mixed in with trying to make sense of the world. And I have Radio 4 on almost, constantly, and keeping update with what was going on. Some of it, I'm sure, and as I know now, it fed in. It went all the way through. Somehow I processed it, and it sort of came out into the piece that I made at that point, which is the lapis lazuli piece, the same size as a large, like pin badge. And I carved, almost exactly. I made the recess in the back, and I sprung a pin inside to make it look like a cheap pin badge. But on the face of it, I decided to just put the emoji face of confused. So there's 2 stars for eyes and 5 with a downturned mouth, and a kind of graphic, a graphic symbol as you would use the emoji if you were confused. And so I sort of laboured over it, and so something maybe kind of got me going on that. And I thought, I made that one for myself. I didn't at that time knew or imagine that it would carry on. So I was right in the midst of being wowed by a new material, to me, a stone, and trying to wrestle with it, find out about it. And at the same time, there was a lot going on around me that I think, sort of got absorbed into that, and that's how it all started. And it led on to other responses and ideas, and I ended up making a series based around the lapis lazuli set, so with different faces on the surface, so inlaid with different stars, different configurations, each time perhaps commenting on something, trying to make sense of it. And they're perhaps titled delayed reactions in the sense there was a delay in absorbing the time of events and processing it, and also the longevity, the kind of time it took just for me to make in stone. It took a long time because I was all making the mistakes and discovering and making improvements as I was going along.
What are the challenges of making in stone?
I think for me it's that unexpectedness that can be a frustration. I think you imagine it's very hard and and very sturdy, which it is, but you don't appreciate that actually within that there's fragility and the different types of stone you might come across, and they have their own different properties. So without that knowledge of gemology and insight into the mineral structure, sometimes I'm just cutting away, or I might be forcing something, and actually there was probably a way to do it that's much more sympathetic to the type of stone that I've got in hand. So in a way, I sort of learnt by trial and error and just trying things out. It's never the same. So to have created that series, I think my initial thought was, as you would imagine, I would want them the same. And actually that's not on offer to me in the stone. So every piece of lapis is entirely different. There are subtle changes and inclusions of other minerals that make it a bit more crumbly, I would say, sort of brittle. So it's not as tight a material. But in the end, I embraced it. I thought, well, this is how I'm doing it and how I would appreciate it. So in the scheme of things, you can judge the quality of a stone by what's it's free of, let's say. So let's say lapis, the bluer it is, the higher the value, or the greater the appreciation. I was quite content that it was the stone I had, and I could find within that a way to express the idea. So I wasn't so particularly hung up about the kind of quality in that sense of the stone, but I just wanted it to do what I wanted it to do, hold together and more or less say, what I was hoping, to try and achieve with each piece. But that's also its strength. I think that the fact it can be a bit fragile. You can't have the same piece twice, even if you parted the same rock. It has those unique qualities to it. And I think in a way that does add to, maybe the beauty of seeing a collection. Then you can kind of appreciate that there's variety in that, and it goes against the kind of blanked out mass-produced idea of the same badge, exactly the same. I think it added to that as well without knowing it at the time, upon reflection.
I'm intrigued. I mean, in this process, it sounds like the material came before the idea. Is that the way that you work generally, or how does your practice, what is your process in that sense, the relationship between idea and material?
Well, that's interesting because that also shifted up until the point of working with stone. I still do to a certain extent now, but I've always been driven by an idea. So I would think about a concept or, something that I'm trying to, wanting to express. And then I would gather the materials together, maybe to try and help me say that, so it starts off that way, and then the materials get pulled together. Working with stone, it was the sort of complete opposite. So you're right in the sense it starts with the material. So I would have to kind of feel around and imagine what I could say with that, what that might lead to, what this might suggest, in the qualities of the stone itself. And sometimes it's quite detailed, and other times it's just the sense of a colour, in the delayed reaction series with the blue. So the fact that it was a blue stone and the same colour as the EU flag, the same azure colour, and azurite is the blue mineral that makes lapis the lovely blue that it is, and the gold. So in this instance, I'm borrowing much more from the material and letting that drive and maybe instill ideas. So that's been quite a big shift, and it's been a lovely way to work.
I mean, it seems to me you're constantly playing with the possibilities of jewellery and what jewellery is, and also the things around jewellery, really. And I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
intrigued by your Keep series, where you produce pieces with titles such as Bottom of a Plastic Bag that looked, I mean, the piece itself looked like the bottom of a plastic bag,
Yes,
only it was made from rock crystal and attached to an 18-karat gold chain. I mean,
yes.
what was the thinking behind that series, Lim?
You're right. I do have this fascination with jewelry in all ways and forms, in thinking about it conceptually, owning it, wearing it. I appreciate it, and I teach and I engage with it as well. So I find it a really, an enlivening and inspirational, subject to explore and object or piece to wear and engage with. And I just noticed that part of the life of jewelry or the object and thinking about it is maybe its care and where it lives in our homes or on our desktops or in our pockets or connection with the body, so, and that detachment as well. So coming back to, keeping items that we never wear, and it's still there somewhere, kind of safe and meaningful, you know where it is. And I find that quite interesting. I find that kind of proximity of where an object is can also tell us something about how we, look after it and care about it. And that's not always positive. Sometimes it's a bit of neglect and absent-mindedness. And I found that I do care for my jewelry and objects, but I'm also quite practical. So, and I used to travel a lot, so I always had jewelry with me, and I enjoy wearing other people's work, very rarely my own. And I noticed I would just, not out of disrespect for the piece, but just out of practicality, I would wrap it up in whatever I had. And if you're a maker, you've got, work everywhere and jewelry everywhere, and they're always in plastic bags, little pouches, and that jewelers or makers are familiar, just that first contact of a piece that you hide away or protect. So I started to think about where my objects were and how I looked after it, and at the same time, carving into rock crystal, appreciating the clarity of it and getting to grips with it. I just decided to maybe meditate a little bit further and speak about jewelry in another way. So making a kind of new object to speak about maybe looking after something sentimental. So these carved little bags or bottom of a plastic bag, you can't see the object in, but I guess I'm trying to make you think about the act of caring or looking after what was in there. So it took the space a piece would be in the bag or wrapped up in a tissue or, in a corner of a box. So a kind of contrast with the absent-mindedness in every day. But nevertheless, there was something important in there, and as a new piece of jewellery.
Is it important that people wear these pieces for you?
That's a good question. I think it's something, it's never at the forefront of what I'm thinking about, but I find it a nice challenge because when you think sort of conceptually and deal with ideas, it's very, it's easy and to forget, like you say, the wearing of jewellery. So I do find it a nice challenge to be able to try and build that into the piece, to involve it as well, as best I can. Because I find ultimately, just to make a lovely object, it can work. But I think it's also an extra challenge if I can make it wearable as well, and I don't lose any of the concept, or, it's not a compromise. So to build it in as a point of focus in a kind of sympathetic way, I think it's nice. And if I do see people wearing it, I feel sometimes it gives it another life, doesn't it? I think you see it on someone being worn, being appreciated, and almost at that point it sort of belongs to them, even momentarily. It leaves me, and you kind of accept that.
Is that a strange feeling when it goes?
I've been asked this before, and I've thought about it myself. The pieces, because I think they seem very personal and quite singular and almost from sentimental, starting points. It's not an odd feeling. I sort of, as the years have gone on, I think I quite welcome that. I quite enjoy it. It's slightly part of the, maybe like the whole reveal at the end. It's sort of a kind of, yeah, no, I enjoy it. I think it's nice. I like the fact that it can go off and, have its own life and be appreciated in another way, or not appreciated, in fact. You sort of get to the point where making or expression isn't entirely just from my perspective, although it obviously starts that way, but I'm also engaging in the world and a bigger conversation. You're a part of something, so I quite enjoy that now. I do like to see that.
Can we talk a little bit about your background? You were the third daughter, and your parents were originally from Hong Kong. You grew up in Wiltshire, where your father ran a Chinese takeaway.
Yes.
How did the family end up there?
Well, my father came over in the late 50s, early 60s. He sailed over from Hong Kong, and without my mother at the time. And he was part of an influx of economic migrants that came from Hong Kong to the UK. And actually he sailed into Liverpool and started off there, actually, in his work and career. He trained as a chef and a cook. And he worked in kitchens as a young man there, I believe, and then sort of over into Middlesbrough. So there's a connection there. I think as the years went on, he decided to bring my mother over, and sort of put down roots in England. So he worked his way down the country, and I don't exactly know how he found Amesbury, of all places, famous for Stonehenge around the corner in Wiltshire. And I'm ever grateful that he did, because it's had in my upbringing, and I was born here, so I don't have any connection to their life in Hong Kong, or any, apart from their stories and what they, brought us up with, and the way that they lived. So it's nice that he decided to put roots down somewhere almost entirely different to, let's say, how he grew up and where mum and dad lived. And maybe the similarity is maybe the countryside. I think my parents always had appreciation of the outside rather than cities, and there was an abundance of that where we grew up. And I mentioned Stonehenge because it is of course, incredibly famous and huge landmark and significance, but also the landscape and the history of that area, and it did feed into my upbringing at school. We would have visits there, so maybe my father appreciated in the same way that I grew to as I got older. It was never fully expressed, but I can imagine he maybe turned up one day, went driving around and thought, oh, I quite like this place. I'm going to put down roots here and open a takeaway. So yeah, that's how we grew up.
And was the takeaway like a family concern? Were you working there as well, or how did that work?
Yes, in my early years, I think more as a young child rather than as a teenager. So yeah, it was run by my father, and my family worked there. At that time, we actually, lived above in the flats, so we were right above the takeaway in the kitchens that were downstairs, in the village at the time. That's how we grew up. We would, get up. I would go to school. The weekends, I would help in the kitchens, help my mother and father, and odd evenings we would be there, or if not, we would be living up in the flats doing homework or something. So there was a sense of we were a very sort of practical family, really. And my father was educated in Hong Kong and went to school, but my mother wasn't. So she sort of had a different outlook onto the world, maybe much more philosophical and much more immediate and domestic. And so she looked after us and brought us up while my father was working. And that was quite nice, a kind of sense of practicality that you can make things and do things and explore life that way, as well as, contemplating on it and thinking about it. So I found that sort of quite influential in a way in how I think about things and approach things, even now in the making.
I remember you saying, I think to Jenny Murray on Woman's Hour, that you, and I'm going to quote, interpret creativity as a constant source of annoyance to my parents. So I'm intrigued. Does that mean that there wasn't a lot of art or making going on in your household, or?
Yeah, I think I laugh at that because it really was that, it's all the curiosity that a child has of making and breaking things and trying to mend them again, so it was a sort of constant annoyance and badgering of, how is this? What is this? What's it made of? And can I take it apart or reassemble it or something? So in that sense, we were very creative, but not in the way where I was exposed to art through what's going on outside in the world. It was much more of a kind of practical creativity, kind of knitting, sewing, creating, making kites, this sort of thing. And a kind of discovering a sense of creativity in that way. I'm partly from school, so I'm exposed to art and artists from school. So that was very important. So it wasn't at home. We had some books. We had the classic. There was a dictionary and encyclopedia, but very little else. Or they were in Chinese, and I didn't learn Chinese when I was younger, so they were fascinating to me, but I didn't understand them. And it's not until school or a library or a school visit to a museum or something like that would instill this sense of another way to use creativity in making beyond like the immediate needs or practicality of a home setting. But I saw parallels, but also obviously like big differences. So yeah, it wasn't engendered at home in that sense. This kind of learning about art and design that came from school, college, and then at university.
When did it dawn on you that you wanted to be a maker or an artist? Was there a moment you can pinpoint?
I think it was probably as early as from school. I think in engaging in the different subjects, how it was separated then. You had I imagine schooling, it's like this now, but this division of the academic subjects, and then there was art and a kind of creativity. I guess it's done that way to manage each discipline. So I had a leaning towards the creative subjects. I think I felt then that not only did I enjoy the creative side, the making, the painting or the drawing, I found I could advance in it. At least I saw a way through that I could, kind of either get better, which is always the impression you advance and get better. But I felt there was a sense even then that you can kind of discover other truths, or it seems very grand for like a school child thinking about it. But I do remember thinking that I thought, gosh, this is quite inspirational. This is you're tapping into other ways of thinking here, and exploring, and actually a much more rounded way to judge something. I found that quite liberating. And maybe that's the distinction, that actually there were different ways to agree or disagree, and I thought that was quite exciting. So some people would like something, let's say, and then others wouldn't, and I enjoyed that dialogue. I think that I remember having with either the art teacher or the other students. We were all doing the same thing, and yet it all came out always entirely different. And I thought that was fascinating to notice, whilst, let's say, the other subjects, not that they were, any less easy or difficult. It's just that it seemed like you would arrive at one conclusion, and it's the application of that conclusion that probably has the excitement to it. But as a school child, you don't really know what you're going to do with all that knowledge. So it seemed narrow in that sense. And I think I enjoyed the art subjects because there was a collective freedom to it, and I thought that was quite nice.
The notion of becoming a jewellery designer came later still, when you were doing a BA at the University of Brighton in wood, metal, ceramics and plastic. It seems the turning point, interestingly, was the discovery of a book.
Oh yes, the course is wood, metal, ceramics, plastics, as you say, and it attracted me, I think, because of that, like exploring these materials, and as part of the what we studied and what we looked into. Then the kind of what you did with that material came through. So we explored making different objects and ceramics, and then jewellery and metalwork also, came into that. And whilst I remember, learning about those techniques, I discovered the new jewellery trends and traditions by Peter Dormer and Ralph Turner, and that really was, an eye opener. I think, in the same way that you imagine you sort of knew something about an object and subject, oh, you think you know what jewelry is, and we're going to make these pieces, and yet when I discovered that book, I thought the breadth and variety within it that also encompassed all these materials and ways of thinking, and I'm just thinking about it now. I remember there were sections within it, and it's titled "Jewelry as," jewelry as image, jewelry as theatre, and it felt very exciting to me. I thought it was really inspirational. So it had a really significant point in kind of opening up my eyes to artists that have explored those issues with materiality and wearing.
For the listeners, we should just explain that the new jewellery was written in 1985, and it showcased work from artists such as Heis Backer and Caroline Broadhead, Susanna Heron, who were kind of interested in experimenting with the hierarchy of materials, I guess, making things from, I don't know, acrylic and paper, and questioning our notion of what we hold precious and why precisely. And it was a forerunner to lots of different movements in the design world in general, I would argue. So as soon as you started leafing through this, you knew what you wanted to do.
I think from that point, the idea of making jewellery, I think I knew it then. So if the course was for you to find, sympathy, let's say with a material or way of expression, and ultimately you sort of end your degree making particular things, I think I knew then that jewellery, at that point, metalwork was, really for me. So that, what was contained in that book, and as you say, the artists that you've just mentioned, were sort of quite profoundly influential. I thought their way of thinking, I kind of wanted to join in that conversation of exploration. I think I remember thinking that.
And what did your early work look like?
Oh, from Brighton.
Yeah.
I actually made ceramic vessels as well, so ceramic forms, pieces that were related to the ceramic forms that were objects, but you could take smaller parts away and wear them. And I think they were made of metal, and I think I called them sort of amulets. So they had smaller pieces of ceramic inside the little containers. So they were, I guess you could say, they were a bit like types of lockets, or wearing something sentimental or amuletic that would hold something. And so I would put small parts of ceramics inside. There was a pin that you could freely pin onto your, clothing. And I remember asking my father at the time to write maybe some words, or words of luck or for protection in Chinese, because actually Dad was quite a good calligrapher. He had a real way with writing in brush and ink. It was very beautiful, actually. At least I thought it was, very beautiful, and that symbolism of Chinese characters. So I remember asking him to do some on some, handmade paper, and he sent them to me, and I folded them up very small, and I popped them into these brooches. And so they were sort of slightly hidden, slightly private, but I knew they were there, and so they featured as part of the pieces.
I mean, you ended up getting an MA from the Royal College of Art, and there's a rather lyrical, I think, a rather beautiful story about your graduation piece and a chance meeting with a Greek woman that seems to, in some way, encapsulate or says something about your approach to jewellery.
Yes. In that last year, so the Royal College, building up a kind of body of work, I was already thinking about maybe a sense of jewelry and sentimentality, and I was sort of using recognizable forms of jewelry then, so looking at rings and bangles, so using those structures to sort of carry an idea. And sort of halfway through that last year, I did meet a Greek lady, and I remember distinctly seeing from the bottom of her sleeve in one corner, she had a big sort of gold ring, and it was attached to her watch strap, and it was dangling out of her, clothing, her sleeve. And I distinctly remember noticing it, and I politely asked about it, and she told me that her husband had recently died, and this was his wedding ring that she kept with her. And he had, quite big fingers, and she was quite a delicate lady, so it didn't fit her fingers. She didn't want to wear it around her neck on a chain, and not, on show, and she didn't want to hide it either. So she just thought practically I would just, put it through my watch strap, and it would be there. And I remember thinking, firstly, what sort of moving kind of story, really. It was a lovely thing to do, and it just, that vision of it stayed with me for quite a long time, and I was really curious about it. So whilst I was developing the collection, my graduate collection, that thought got involved into the collection pieces. So I made a replica of the ring. At the time, I asked to see it, and inside was engraved her name in Greek and the year that they were married. So I remembered, and I made notes, and unbeknownst to her, I sort of went off and made a replica of it. So I scaled it up to the size of a bangle, a replica, and engraved her name inside, and put the date on, and I had it as part of my show. And I did ask for her permission to do something. She didn't know what I was going to do, but I asked, I was very inspired by seeing this, and, would you mind if I use some of these thoughts in my own work? They inspire me. And I had the piece in the show, and she came along to see it, and she was very moved. And the lovely thing is that she bought the piece, and now she owns it. So she owned it from that day, and she does wear it from time to time. And that was, over 20 years ago. So you're right. It probably does encapsulate, almost like, let's say in a nutshell, perhaps I would go from a thought, seeing something, I would sort of, rally around, gather materials or a way of working, decide upon it, and then there's an outcome, and a piece. And it wasn't necessarily made for her, but as it is, she owns it now, and it belongs to her.
Well, it's interesting because while you're doing pieces that are, fundamentally, I guess you could argue, installation art, you've also taken on commissions, the biggest of which was the medals for the Paralympic Games in 2012 in London, which was based on the idea of Nike, the goddess of victory. Presumably for a project like that, which I'm guessing has to go through numerous committees, you have to think in a very different way. I'm guessing more like an industrial designer rather than an artist, perhaps.
Yes, you're right. It was a huge project, and also in timescale, I think it took up 2 years, almost sort of non-stop, really, in the development of it, and all under almost in secrecy to before the grand reveal at the end. So that was unusual in itself, that only sort of nearest and dearest that I could talk to about it, and I enjoy talking about my work, and I find actual creative expression through that is sort of important. So actually to kind of try to keep it to myself was quite difficult already, and it was very different. Yeah, I think actually to appreciate that they were very supportive. I think everybody that I worked with, no matter how big the team was, and there was the Olympic Committee, there was also the Royal Mint as well, and everybody else, that also has to meet and kind of agree on every little detail that goes on the medal, and sometimes things would have to happen overnight, because to get a group of people together to view something is not an easy task. So the pace of things and having to kind of work in that way was very difficult at times, and responding to that. Whilst if you work on your own, you can more or less set your own deadlines and work within that structure, and I'm more used to that. So I think that shift of gear in working and collaborating was quite exciting at the same time as quite difficult to juggle. And so I learnt a huge amount of working with people and consideration and maybe appreciating a bit more and thinking ahead of what they would expect and what they would want. Generally, I would be just having that conversation with myself if I'm making my own pieces and work. And so that sense of appreciation, I think, from all perspectives, was very good. It was quite tough at times, I think.
So I'm intrigued in your monograph called Tomfoolery, which is a pun on jewellery, a Cockney rhyming slang, obviously. There's a section that contains a kind of email exchange between you and Caroline Broadhead, who we mentioned earlier. And there's a quote I'd like to take from it where you write, "The imagination is a wondrous and tortuous tool." And you go on to add, "The joy or frustration of making comes in trying to achieve this perfection in reality." So are you a perfectionist, Lynn? And does this make life difficult?
I think I make life difficult for myself, yes. I think that's entirely true. It is a wondrous and torturous tool because you can imagine, or at least I imagine to such a degree, there is a form of perfection to it, and it's just so different in reality. But I've come to accept, actually, that is where the excitement happens, isn't it? It's that trying to match up what's actually happening with what you're imagining, what you're thinking, and then dealing with the realities of it. So I've learned to maybe kind of take out the frustration and kind of embrace that, okay, there may be that aim and towards a kind of perfection. But actually there's another kind in, staring right back at you with what you've just done. And I think that sometimes you can't imagine that, no matter how how kind of knowledgeable you are, how much experience you have. I think it's probably what keeps you going, as an artist, or me as a maker, is just when you think you know enough, or you think you know all, that the reality tells you something different. And I think that's sort of quite exciting. But yeah, I do I do remember that kind of dialogue that I had with Caroline. That was really great, actually. We sort of thought about each of our processes, and what drives us, what we think about how things actually work. And I think there is that. If I picture something, and I think I don't think I'm unique in it. If you say a circle, your mind pictures, something perfect. It's never a wiggly circle or a square. It's actually perfect. And so there's a slight, a kind of a goal or a target that's ultimately out of reach anyway. So it's also important to focus on what's happening in your hands and what you're trying to achieve there, and to try and balance the two. So I think noticing that was sort of was funny and also enlightening at the same time.
You've been a long-standing tutor at Central St Martin's in London, which you alluded to earlier. Teaching is obviously an important part of your practice, your life. What do you enjoy about it? Why do it?
Why do it? Not only the subject that I teach in, and it is jewellery, and I've been involved with it probably as long. I guess it's coming up to maybe it's coming up to maybe almost 20 years now, involved in the subject and seeing how it's developed, and the nature of teaching these days, particularly at Central St Martin's. We have lots of students, so that seeing that shift over the years. And how we engage with students. I think what keeps me going is maybe it's a part of that exchange. I think it's not I'm trying to impart my knowledge directly, with students. I feel that dialogue and sharing something and discovering how almost each individual deals with the subject of jewellery, the making of it, and going through all the sort of trials and tribulations of making and thinking about it, finding their way in the world. I really enjoy that. I find that invigorating for me. and it keeps me on my toes. And also, I think the sense of maybe nurturing something that's shared with each student. It's like finding their voice, their place within it. What they want to say, and tapping into that. So it feels like a kind of shared experience. It feels like there's sort of me, them, and the jewellery in front of us. So it's like a dialogue between three of us, including the object or the subject we're talking about. And I find that quite exciting to be in. Times 50 50 different conversations about jewelry at any one time. That's a challenge and an eye-opener, and and incredibly satisfying at the same time. So it's never the same, and that continues to pulls me in, and I'm still with it. So I think it's probably that.
Lin, I've taken up loads of your time. So this is the final question, and then I will let you get on and do what you've got to do. Traditionally, at this stage of the interview, we ask, what are your plans for the future? What can we be expecting from you?
Well, since sort of lockdown is, slightly easing, I can see that, sort of life is coming back, not to entirely normal, but we're finding our way through things. I think looking forward to kind of engaging back out into the world again, and maybe even starting up teaching, going back to university a bit, seeing students and colleagues. And I think with work, it's kind of carrying on really. There's so much more to discover. I feel like even though I've been working these past few years with stone, I'm still almost so at the beginning of something, it feels like, and there's so much to discover. So I think let's see what happens. I think I'd love to get kind of making and grinding and cutting again with the material, and seeing how the past few months have maybe could get absorbed into that somewhere.
Well, Lin, that was lovely. It was completely beguiling. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And to learn more about Lin's work, go to lincheung.co.uk. There are images from the interviews as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from. If you feel so inclined, you can go to my Patreon page and make a pledge at patreon.com/material matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Just to let you know too that I'm planning to do one more of these lockdown specials in July. Then we'll be taking a short break before coming back in September. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you're all staying safe.